All right, so welcome everybody to this roundtable on mimetic connections. It's good to see some people online and some colleagues in the room. As you know, I've joined Lucas relatively recently, and Lucas is a Center for the Arts and Society, and mimesis is traditionally a problematic that is located exactly at the intersection of art and society. And so I thought it would be interesting to establish some connections with colleagues who are working, maybe not with the concept of mimesis, but with problematics that are very much related to it. And so I'm privileged to be joined by a number of Lucas colleagues, Jan van Dijkhuizen from Literary Studies, early modernist. So we are bringing different disciplinary perspective, but also different periods. Yasco Horsman from Film and Literary Studies. Stijn De Cauwer, who is a recent addition to the Lucas team. And I know him from Leuven already. And Mathijs Peters, who is also working in film and literary studies. And so what we thought we would do is that I would give a brief general presentation of this project I led for 5 years now on Homo Mimeticus, and then I hand it over to my colleagues to see what kind of connections you see with your own work, and have a roundtable and discussion, and then open it up to people online and here for questions. I should say there are a number of books that have appeared this year and last year. The latest one is a book titled Violence and the Mimetic Unconscious. And I don't have the book yet, but I know it's possible. The author is very often the last to get the book. Yeah, I saw people having that book in the States, and it just came out with Michigan University Press. And it's a book on violence and the unconscious. So I'll be saying some things about it later on. But just to start with, I wanted to give you the general context that triggered this interest in mimesis in the first place. And I was in the US at the time, and mimesis comes from mimos, which means actor. And it's linked to performance. And there was a mime on the political scene in 2015 that wasn't taken seriously by many people in political science. And I thought, well, he is adopting rhetorical strategies that operate mimetically. And I started paying attention to it. And so I wasn't too surprised when in 2021, something like the storming of the Capitol happened, because I've been worrying about it for some time. So there is a political dimension of mimesis that I've been attentive to. In the middle of the project, the COVID pandemic happened, and viruses are mimetic in the sense that they reproduce themselves very quickly, but also in the sense that they tend to generate emotional reactions that are not necessarily based on reason alone, generating a number of conspiracies at the time. And also generating a situation in which people were locked in, and violence was a problematic that emerged as a problematic that was central to the COVID pandemic. In addition to the viral infection, also outbreaks of domestic violence, especially directed against women. So that was also part of the context. And at the same time, mimesis cannot be divided according to good and bad categories, but tends to go beyond good and evil, to use that phrase. And so depending on the models, we saw the importance of good models in order to induce basic behavior that was important to adopt during a pandemic crisis, like washing hands, getting vaccinated, and so forth. Now, we're doing this session here in October 2023, and violence has just increased since. And violence, question of war, the war in Ukraine and what is happening in Israel, also operates mimetically, in the sense that one action tends to generate a reaction, and there is a danger of escalation of violence, which also rests on a mimetic principle. And I already mentioned conspiracy theories. When I started working, there wasn't ChatGPT yet, but that's yet another supplement to the field that I thought was necessary in order to account for the different manifestation of mimesis that I started calling with my team mimetic studies. And so now that we have ChatGPT, I thought, it would be interesting to see what is the ChatGPT definition of mimetic studies. This is one of the goals of this ERC project, was to initiate that. And so the answer is interesting. ChatGPT says mimetic studies, also known as mimetics, not memetics, mimetics, is an interdisciplinary field of study that focuses on the imitation, replication, and representation of culture and social phenomena. Imitation, replication, representation. So I already see the plurality of meanings behind mimesis. And then it's added, the term mimetic is derived from the Greek word mimesis or mimesis, which means imitation or representation. And then in mimetic studies, researchers explore how humans and societies mimic, copy, or emulate various aspects of the world around them, including behaviors, ideas, art, symbols, rituals, and more. And I was thinking, well, this is not a bad definition to start with, actually. It's pretty good. And I like specifically the distinction between imitation or representation, because that has been one of the main foci of attention of this Homo Mimeticus project, to call attention to mimesis beyond representation, beyond issues of realism. And usually, since some of you are new here, the way I traditionally had to define the project was to say that, well, mimesis is not original. ERC usually promotes original research. So if you come with mimesis, you don't come really with an original concept, but you might take it from a different angle. And the angle was that Plato and Aristotle disagree about the value of mimesis understood as a representation of the world. Plato critiques it for its illusory nature, whereas Aristotle defended it for its rational qualities of mimesis. So they disagreed on mimesis as representation, but they fundamentally agreed that humans are mimetic animals. And that agreement was basically the starting point of the project that Homo Mimeticus that I explored from three different but related perspectives. There was a component in aesthetics and arts, a figure that I often mention is Oscar Wilde, who famously argued that life imitates art more than art imitates life. And it's very often taken even by Wilde scholars as one of those witty epigrams and so forth. But there is a philosophical reason behind that, the idea that life is mimetic, that we imitate artistic models. So there is that component. In philosophy, Nietzsche was a main figure that served as a source of inspiration, specifically his idea that we should develop genealogies. The genealogy of morals starts with this phrase that wir sind uns unbekannt, we are unknown to ourselves. We call ourselves Homo sapiens, but we might also be Homo Mimeticus. So that was an important starting point. And then on the social sciences, I already mentioned the problematic of contagion on the political front, and I've written a little book titled New Fascism to account for that. There is also a future-oriented dimension via sci-fi, the effect of new technologies and the generation of a post-human mimesis that, for instance, is dramatized in series like Black Mirror in interesting ways. So this was just to give you, for those of you who are not familiar with the project, kind of the general overview and perspectival approach. And the general idea was indeed to move beyond representation, a mimetic turn or return of mimesis that recuperates the ancient definition of mimesis as performance, theatrical performance linked to acting. And if mimesis is very often restricted to realism, to the representation of the world, to the trope of the mirror that copies passively reality with all the aesthetic and metaphysical connotation that the Platonic heritage has left with us and that are still internal to a classic like Erich Auerbach, mimesis, or the representation of reality in the West. I thought it would be interesting to treat mimesis as a human condition. And that is the definition that Günter Gebauer and Christoph Wolff, two German scholars, an anthropologist and a philosopher, gave in a book titled Mimesis. I invited them in a workshop, and we've been collaborating in order to pay attention to mimetic subjectivity, to the fact that humans imitate other people. And once again, that the origins of mimesis come from mimos, from acting, so it is something embodied. It's a chameleon concept, and yes, it remains central to aesthetics, but also to politics, as I mentioned, education, psychology, anthropology, and so forth. And so this is the basic context of what I called mimetic studies. And since I was on ChatGPT, I couldn't resist the question. So who founded mimetic studies? And the reply this time is like this: mimetic studies, also known as mimetics, does not have a single founder, as it's a multidisciplinary field that draws from various intellectual traditions and has evolved over time. So I like that kind of, genealogical Foucauldian thing. There is no single origin. But then that, however, one of the key figures associated with the development of mimetic theory, particularly in the context of literature and anthropology, is René Girard. Which is true. René Girard is an important figure when it comes to issues of mimesis specifically linked to anthropology. What I think is not completely correct is the fact that, in a way, I define mimetic studies as an alternative to mimetic theory. So that conflation of mimetic studies and mimetic theory could be supplemented. ChatGPT is not up to date. I think it's 2019, 2020, it's 2 or 3 years behind. So it hasn't incorporated these books where the definition of mimetic studies as an alternative to mimetic theory is articulated in some more detail. We will excuse ChatGPT for that. So yes, 2 books on violence, and I don't want to take up too much time, but maybe in the time that remains, I give you the context of where these 2 books emerged. One is available, the first volume titled Violence and the Oedipal Unconscious, and the other I don't have a copy, but it is possible to purchase it. By the way, the Homo Mimeticus book is open access, so you can download it freely from the site of Leuven University Press, thanks to the ERC funding. But I started thinking about violence, the relationship between violence and mimesis at Johns Hopkins, 2015, 2014. And Johns Hopkins has an interesting genealogy when it comes to mimetic theory, because a number of precursors that are internal to my way of thinking about mimesis, like Jacques Derrida or J. Hillis Miller or René Girard, taught at Hopkins. There was this famous structuralist controversy in 1966 that ended up launching post-structuralism and deconstruction. So there is a kind of genealogical distance that informs those 2 books on violence. But also, if you've ever been to Baltimore, it's a notoriously violent city. Crime and drugs visible just as poverty and racial discrimination are visible. And I was living in a part of Baltimore that was segregated on the African-American side, and my kids were going to an African-American school when I was there. And one day I show up to school, and they tell me that the school is closed and there has been an accident. And so, okay, we return home and try to find out what happened. And one kid in my son's parallel class that died, and it was related to a shooting. And later we find out in the news that the kid had found a loaded gun in his house, and that he accidentally 4 years old. So this is a reality that happened, and kind of brings it home, the reality of violence. And the father turned out to be a policeman as well. So, but this is just one of the many incidents that are so common in the US. And of course, they're related to the problematic of gun availability. Here is just a cartoon that says, well, the parent says guns cause all the troubles. And then the problematic, how do representation of violence in the media, televisions, and now video games impact violence as well? And it's not an either or explanation, or you cannot pin it down to one cause. Education is a crucial factor. Of course, gun regulation is another. Poverty and crime are others. But it is a question that I started to investigate, and there are a number of books. This question of media violence is really much debated, especially in the social sciences. There is no consensus really, but there is an agreement that there is a correlation between exposure to violence on media but no causation, because causation, how do you prove it? It's difficult to prove causation, but the question of correlation is established. And what interested me was the fact that many of these studies use concepts like catharsis or contagion. I was interested in figuring out where these concepts come from, to trace a genealogy in the Nietzschean sense. Here is a trailer that I wanted to watch, but I'll skip by a movie titled Vice with Bruce Willis. It's a movie where vice is a resort in which all kinds of violent behavior is made available, directed against robots or androids, female androids. And there is a crime that spills from the world of vice, that it's obviously metaphorical of the world of the internet, to the real world. And an investigator investigates the crime, and he uses the term, maybe not the term catharsis, but he says something of the sort. You'd think that if people could commit any crime they would want, they get it out of their system. But people get a taste and they can't get enough. And so this idea of, getting it out of your system, blowing off steam, having a cathartic effect is something that has infiltrated even popular culture. And that was, to me, interesting, since this notion of catharsis, which is very difficult to translate in Aristotle's Poetics, it appears just as a passing moment. It's one of the riddles that philologists have been struggling to unpack over the centuries, since the Poetics was rediscovered in the Renaissance. And so I thought, okay, let's have a look at these two hypotheses. The catharsis hypothesis, the idea that if you're exposed to violence, let's say in a tragic play, Sophocles' Oedipus Rex, or more recently a movie or a video game, generates a purgation or purification, and you're left to define what kind of catharsis is actually at play. And I thought I could do it in an article. Of course, that was very naive on my part. It turned out to be two articles, one on catharsis that goes from Aristotle to Freud and Girard, and then one that looks at the contagious hypothesis, where I looked at Plato primarily, affect, and the recent discussions on mirror neurons. And then I thought, well, there is much more that I can do than two articles. And so I planned a book on the relationship between violence and the unconscious, kind of sequel to René Girard, Violence and the Sacred. And since Girard didn't talk about media violence, I thought it would be interesting. And there too, I didn't manage to contain it in one book. And so I divided it in two books. The first volume deals with catharsis. Proved to be very difficult to unpack, but I started with Girard because I think that Girard is the latest representative of advocates of catharsis. The idea that if you direct violence against a sacrificial scapegoat, the body politic will be purified of violence. And even though Girard has a notoriously complicated relationship to Freud, my hypothesis is that he's very much influenced by the early Freud, where he developed a cathartic method. And one of the questions that I had is that how come a concept like catharsis that philologists who spend their time kind of, unpacking the Poetics can't kind of agree on what it means, has infiltrated popular culture. And one possibility is indeed that psychoanalysis made it, especially the therapeutic version of catharsis, available to the broader public. So I traced the genealogy of catharsis from Girard to Freud, to Jacob Bernays, who was Freud's uncle-in-law and a specialist of Aristotle's Poetics, who translated the concept of catharsis as a medical purification, and then back to the Poetics itself, in order then to challenge the catharsis hypothesis via Nietzsche, who has an hypothesis that is much closer to the Platonic one, that is that representation of violence actually generate contagious effects. And so that's the other side of the argument, where I trace the contagious hypothesis, starting with Plato, who is much more nuanced and ambivalent about mimesis than is usually represented in dominant commentaries. He writes mimetic dialogues, so he operates on a mimetic registers. And then also looking via Nietzsche at examples of contagious intoxications that reach via new media. The example was the storming of the Capitol, how new media and Donald Trump's use of Twitter managed to generate an insurrection, but also representations of media violence that are at play in TV series like Cops, the TV series Cops, that very often has a white cop chasing an African American, and the problematic of police shootings, I argued, could be extended as a rubric of media violence, where media violence is not restricted to the analysis of films, but pays attention to the way cops actually behave on the models of TV series. So these are all aspects that are somehow internal to the second volumes, which ends on video games and a connection with neuroscience and mirror neurons. That's the general, I would say, scope. Just to conclude, as an alternative to Girard's mimetic theory, a new theory should develop new concepts, and these are just some of the concepts that are internal to the Homo Mimeticus project. I thought that Girard tends to limit mimesis to desire. I prefer the ancient concept of pathos, which is linked to pentos, suffering, but it's very difficult to translate to, and could be translated as affect. Provides a broader starting point that all affects are mimetic. And once we start with that realization that all affects are mimetic, there is not necessarily only the violent component, which I discussed in these books. There can be also a good form of sympathos, sympathy or empathy. Sympathos means traditionally to feel with, not to feel for. And so the idea of an ego that is open to pathos, what Nietzsche calls a phantom of the ego, is another concept that I recuperate, not a phantom of reality or a shadow of reality, but a phantom of the ego. So the ego itself being porous and relational and easily affected or influenced by emotion. Girard triangulate the structure, whereas I'm more interested in a movement of attraction and repulsion towards mimesis, and that's the concept of pathos of distance. Nietzsche uses the concept of pathos of distance to mark the distance between the anti-mimetic sovereign and the mimetic herd, but he calls it a pathos. And a close reading of Nietzsche shows that it's very open to this pathos, so that there are mimetic and anti-mimetic tendencies in the theory of Homo Mimeticus that we propose. And then instead of emphasizing only mimetic rivalry, I thought it's useful to think of theories, the creation of theories, in terms of relationships of what I call mimetic agonism, where a new theorist confronts a predecessor. Let's take the example of Aristotle's Poetics. It's obviously a reply to Plato's critique of mimesis, how to defend poetry. And it does so in an agonistic relationship to Plato, that it's not violent, it's productive, it's intellectually productive. And if you think of Plato, his relationship to Homer, poets, is also one of mimetic agonism. He copies a lot of Homer's strategy, writing dialogues, telling stories. And if one starts paying attention to the history of mimetic studies, you notice that very often this kind of mimetic agon is at play. Girard and Freud is another example, and so forth. Pathologies, mimesis as a pathological component, but also has the potential to generate discursive accounts or logois on mimetic pathos. And so there is this kind of undecidable dimension to mimesis that can generate both pathologies and pathologies, and the difficulty will be how to discern between the two, hence this kind of dash that can connect and disconnect pathologies and pathologies. And then the notion of a mimetic unconscious that is central to the second volume, that has some more kind of mirroring reflexes as an entry, more than the interpretation of Oedipal dreams. So I'll stop there, I think, with a kind of general overview. There are many more other concepts, but I think this kind of provides a general frame then to have a discussion or debate, and I pass it on to my colleague, Jan.
So what I'm going to talk about very briefly is this. So it's interesting how it's usually other people who alert me to the strands in my own work, the long-term strands. And Nidesh made me realize really that there is a long-term mimetic mimesis strand in my work. So I'm grateful to you for pointing that out to me. So I'm going to say a little bit about sort of Christian mimesis. I'm an early modernist, and I did a project a while back on early modern notions of pain, especially religious notions of pain. And the project was really about changing religious understandings of pain during the early modern period. We're going to talk briefly about that, and then I'm going to talk briefly about reconciliation, which is another topic that I've worked on, and it turned out that the idea of mimesis is really central to both. And but first, we're going to talk about pain, and there are three components to that: imitatio Christi, imitatio Mariae, so the imitation of Mary, and imitatio Dei, the imitation of God. So if you could move to the next slide, I've got a little quote for you that sort of encapsulates quite nicely a very important, dominant, late medieval and early modern Roman Catholic meditative tradition that sees it as our duty as human beings to meditate deeply on Christ's pain as he is hanging on the cross. The idea is to hang with Christ, as it were, to meditate so intensively on his pain that we share in it and that we imitate it. And there's a lovely phrase at the end, true imitation. So this is from a 17th century Roman Catholic meditation manual by Luis de la Puente in an English translation, published on the continent at the Jesuit College in Saint-Omer, as you can see. I'll just read it to you because it really kind of nicely illustrates what we're talking about. The meditant is instructed here to consider the dolor that the most blessed Virgin endured at this her first beholding of her son. So Mary is looking at the crucified Christ. It's the kind of the old sort of juxta crucem lacrimosa kind of motive. At this her first beholding of her son, for the eyes of our Lord Jesus and of his mother, encountering one another, became both of them eclipsed and dazzled by the force of sorrow. The mother remained spiritually crucified with the sight of the son, spiritually crucified with the sight of the son. And the son was tormented anew by beholding his mother, each of them holding their peace for very grief and pain. The heart of the one employed in feeling the torments of the other, sorrowing much more for them than for their own. This is the kind of open ego that you were talking about. Your job as meditant then is to put then thyself, O my soul, between those two crucified, and lift up thine eyes to behold the son crucified with great nails of iron, then cast them down to look upon the mother crucified with sharp stings of dolor and compassion. Beseech them both to divide their pains with thee in such sort that thou mayst be crucified with them by a true imitation. And so the meditation becomes so intense, as it were, that the dividing lines, if you like, between meditant and the object of the meditation blur. You become the suffering Christ, you become the suffering Mary. Now, in the project that I did on pain, one thing that interested me is that, there we go, is that Yogi Berra, the famous US baseball player, had something to say about this, that early modern Protestant theologians argued that what we just saw is impossible. And there is a lovely quote by the bishop, 17th century Church of England bishop, Joseph Hall, in which he dismisses this whole late medieval kind of affective piety, as it's called, that centers so much on imitatio Christi through suffering. He writes that we cannot conceive so much as the heinousness and desert of one of those sins which thou bearest. Thou is the suffering Christ here. We can no more see thy pain than we could undergo it. There is imitation, but not for us, okay? Only this we see, that what the infinite sins of almost infinite men committed against an infinite majesty deserved an infinite continuance. All this thou in the short time of thy passion hast sustained. We may behold and see, but all the glorious spirits in heaven cannot look into the depth of this suffering. And to quote Yogi Berra, if you can't imitate him, don't copy him, one of those famous yogiisms, right? So what's the point of meditating so intensively on Christ? What's the point of imitatio Christi through suffering? If really Christ's suffering is unique and we can only sort of admire it from a distance. So we're in the early modern period, we're at and I find a really interesting kind of shift, right? A kind of a watershed moment in how Christianity thinks about the relation between human pain and divine pain, and between human beings and the pains of Christ. And what I ended up arguing is that in spite of this kind of stuff, Protestants found all kinds of ways of sneaking the idea of imitating Christ through suffering back into their spiritual culture. So the urge to imitate Christ in his suffering held enormous appeal that wouldn't go away in spite of what, theologians like Joseph Hall said. And for the final slide, and then I'll end, I did a project on reconciliation, representations of interpersonal reconciliation in literary texts from Shakespeare to the present day. And one recurring idea in Christian culture that I came across is this, I find, slightly weird notion that in forgiving, in reconciling, in resolving conflict, we imitate God. We imitate divine forgiveness. So that there's this book, very long study in German on the kind of political theology of reconciliation. And he asked at some point, as a theologian, I ask, how is it even possible that human beings can resolve their conflicts? And he says, it's because there is a preceding act of forgiveness by God, in which God forgives sinful human beings. And so all we do when we settle conflicts is to imitate that foundational prior act of reconciling. It sounds a bit nuts to me, to be honest. I mean, the idea that if it weren't for this prior act by God, we'd be locked in conflict, all the time. So this is what a recent study, a recent article by sort of an Anglican theologian says, Anthony Bash, he says, if we forgive, it is because we ourselves have experienced the lavish grace of God's forgiveness. So we are enabled to forgive by God's prior act of forgiving our sins. And so, again, the idea of mimesis, of imitating some kind of divine example, is so crucial again here. And I wonder where that's gone. Do we still feel this way? And finally, as I think you will recognize, there was a really dominant model of especially interpersonal reconciliation, which revolves around remorse. Okay, so if I've wronged you, say Stijn, I become eligible for your forgiveness if I manage to convince you that I feel heartfelt remorse, right? And you are convinced that it's sincere and that it's authentic, and that is then a basis for you to say, I'll commit myself to get over my resentment and reestablish relations with you. And that's a sort of a model that seems to come natural to many people in our culture. And it's really interesting that it's ultimately modeled on divine forgiveness. That it's modeled on the idea that what we must do as sinful human beings is to feel remorse before God, and then we become eligible for forgiveness. And at some point, we transposed that to the interpersonal sphere. I think it's hugely problematic for all kinds of reasons that we can maybe talk about later. But these are two instances, reconciliation and suffering, two kind of thematic areas where Christian culture thinks about in intensely mimetic terms. And I wanted to leave it at that. Thanks.
Thanks, Jan. The imitatio Christi tradition is historically enormously important, and it's something that I don't cover in Homo Mimeticus, but it is important important to remember it, especially because it is internal to figures like René Girard.
Yeah, exactly.
A lot of what you said now, taking Christ as a model for forgiveness and reconciliation, it still animates his mimetic theory, which is based on the imitatio Christi. So yes, it reappears, an idea that reappears. I come more from a Nietzschean tradition, so you can imagine that I have a critical approach to that, as you also do articulate. But it's important to keep in mind its power of conviction and that it carries historically. So
it's something you can tap into, as it were, historical tradition that you can tap into. One example actually is, think about abolitionist campaigns in the 19th century that drew heavily on the suffering Christ topos, with the African American slave depicted in ways that were clearly meant to make them look like the suffering Christ, and tapping into this notion that we as human beings have this obligation to respond empathetically to Christ in his pain. So it's an idea that you can actually tap into politically for more kind of progressive ends, if you like.
Thanks very much. I'm also reminded of the last point I want to make is that someone like Oscar Wilde, who is in many ways so close to Nietzsche in aesthetic sensibility, also ended up writing De Profundis, which is very much based on the imitatio Christi as well, aestheticizing Christ as a model, but growing through suffering via the model of Christ, which I think he blends with the Epicurean and more Stoic Greek traditions. But nonetheless, that figure is present, for instance, in aesthetics, in aestheticism via figures like Oscar Wilde. So thank you for the reminder. Thanks. Yasco.
I typed in chat CGP, how would Yasco Horsman respond to Nidesh Lawtoo's work? And this is what came out. So it starts with Dear Nidesh, so that's nice. And then it continues with thanking you for organizing this event, which gave me the chance to study your work. But I also felt I barely started because there's so much of it. So I wanted to cite a famous remark by a Dutch literary critic on a very prolific Dutch novelist, Simon Vestdijk, who said, I'm sorry, you write faster than God can read. So I apologize if I misunderstood you. So if I understand you correctly, mimesis, the term pointing your work, not simply to realistic representation, as an Auerbach sense of the term, but to a whole problematic cluster of behaviors that we call mimicking or mirroring, a register of feelings and affects, empathy, sympathy, phenomena like contagion and virality. In short, the register of experiences that Lacan in his early writings calls the imaginary. And the register that includes feelings of empathy and understanding, processes of projective identification, affects such as jealousy and aggression, but also moments of comprehension, and we understand something as meaningful. And Lacan opposes this to the symbolic, which he thinks is incommensurable with it. But when he returns to the notion of the imaginary in the 1950s, after first having introduced it in the late 30s, he starts to argue that the imaginary and the symbolic are, although radically and incommensurably different, that they are always intertwined. So the imaginary or the mimetic experience is always framed and structured by the symbolic, so on the one hand. And on the other hand, he suggests that our relation to the symbolic is structured along imaginary lines. I think that's central to his famous seminar on post-Purloined letter. And I have returned to this work of Lacan, this mostly seminar number 1, because it also includes a discussion of the rise of what were at the time the new sciences of cybernetics, rational choice theory, game theory, and communication theory. Lacan calls them the sciences of the symbolic. fields that were at the time new, but that are now at the heart of the algorithmic systems that control our lives. And scholars like Bernard Dionysius Gagin or Lydia Lu have therefore also returned to the Lacan of the 1950s, the Lacan that is interested in the symbolic, so not the late Lacan of the real that had been more fashionable in recent decades. And Lacan develops a critique of these new disciplines that can, I feel, be understood as a mimetic critique. So he argues that each of these new disciplines, cybernetics, game theory, communication theory, offer a mathematical formalization of what had until then be considered as purely human thought processes, such as communication, decision-making, etc. And they demonstrate, cybernetics, game theory, information theory, that such processes can be studied without any consideration of meaning. And so Claude Shannon argues that you can study information in a purely mathematical way, and Wiener theorized about language in purely syntactical terms. Game theorists like von Neumann, they reduce thinking to a series of logical operations. So then Lacan argues that each of these fields articulate their insights in purely formal, symbolical, mathematical terms, without any reference to imaginary domains of meaning, consciousness, interiority. Right? So that's one. And he's interested in that because he's interested in symbolic. But then in the seminar, he emphasizes that these purely formal symbolic processes have imaginary effects because we, as human beings, tend to relate to symbolic structures on an imaginary level. So he explains that we can't help but feel that we are dealing, for example, with persons. We try to understand things or project ourselves into algorithms. So the imaginary, he argues, is thus a necessary structural part of the way that we relate to the symbolic. I have a quote. At this point, this is Lacan, we come upon a precious fact revealed to us by cybernetics, that there's something in the symbolic function of human discourse that cannot be eliminated, and that is the role played in it by the imaginary. So I've been interested in this because I feel that Lacan's critique helps us understand how we relate to the symbolic machines that structure our lives. Algorithmic programs or machines like, say, Facebook, that collect data about us that are aggregated in databases, subjected to calculations. And we somehow know that they're symbolic machines, but we have a narcissistic, imaginary, mimetic relation to it. And we think of Facebook as a mirror in which we can somehow appear to ourselves as lovable. So there's this, it's called a Facebook, not for nothing. So I was interested in that, and I wanted to ask you about it because I have the feeling that you often kind of oppose the mimetic to the linguistic. And you're interested in moments when theoreticians like Nietzsche speak about communication as not something linguistic, but something that is physiological. Or, for example, when you return to pre-Freudian theorists like Charcot and Bernstein, who use mimetic techniques, hypnosis and suggestion, rather than Freud's linguistically based talking cure. For example, when you're interested in Boulez. So, on the one hand, it seems as if language and the mimetic seem to be opposites. On the other hand, there are also moments when you discuss also Nietzsche or Le Roi Courant, where the pre-linguistic mimetic seems to be a source of language. So I was wondering about that, like how do you understand that relation between language and the mimetic? Is it almost in Lacanian, is it like an opposition? Is it like an intertwinement in Lacanian sense, or does one lead to the other? So.
Thanks very much, Yasco, for this important and difficult, actually, question, which is how it should be. I think there are different reasons of my kind of pushing a little bit against the linguistic turn. One of the goals of the Mimeticus project was to promote a mimetic turn, or a return to indeed an embodied conception of mimesis. And I started by mentioning the 1966 Structuralist Controversy Conference, because that was a decisive moment at Johns Hopkins where the linguistic turn was launched, at least in the Anglophone world. A linguistic turn was present already before in France via structuralism. And so in a way, I was shaped by theories of language, by theories of the symbolic. And Lacan is an obvious figure in that respect for somebody interested in the unconscious. So maybe one of the reasons that led me to emphasize the embodied, affective, intersubjective, phenomenological dimension of mimesis over the linguistic one was because of the dominance of the linguistic paradigm in the 90s when it was formed. At the same time, I think you're right in pointing out that Lacan is an interesting ally for mimetic studies, especially the theory of the imaginary, because it is all about mimesis in an affective sense. The child's imaginary relationship in the mirror stage with the imago, with the image, is mimetic. It's a relation of identification. I should mention, for genealogical reason, and I told you that I did graduate work with one of the foremost specialists of Lacan, Mikkel Borch-Jacobsen, who wrote a book on Lacan titled Lacan, the Absolute Master, where he's interested specifically in the mimetic dimension of the imaginary. And his thesis in The Absolute Master is that Lacan develops an early mimetic theory where the child identifies with that image, which is other, which is an alienated image. It's caught in a dialectic between the self and other. It's also an aggressive relationship. And it's a mimetic relationship that, in Borch-Jacobsen's reading, Lacan somehow, in line with a long genealogy, kind of critiques and fears the danger of mimetic confusion and the violence linked to mimesis. And he argues that, in a way, the theory of the symbolic, where it's all about language and mediation, it's a way to kind of contain the imaginary. So I find it interesting that you establish a link between the imaginary and the symbolic, and I agree that it would be interesting to go back to the imaginary, to Lacan theory of the imaginary, to think about a relationship to images on social media, for instance, Facebook, and so forth. Maybe to your question on language and mimesis, when during the linguistic turn, a text by Nietzsche that was often quoted it's a short, unpublished text, Truth and Lies in an Extramoral Sense, where he anticipates in many ways many of the insights that later will be developed by Paul de Man and Derrida, theory of design as arbitrary in many sense. And I was interested instead of Nietzsche in Gay Science, where indeed does argue that if you take an evolutionary perspective, language emerged in a species that he argues, anticipating Lacan, by the way, that we are born too soon, we are born too early, we are born exposed and vulnerable. And therefore, if you want to survive as a species, we need to be able to communicate very quickly. And he argues that mimicry, which he situates in relationship to animal mimicry, is a beginning, a starting point for linguistic communication, that we start through the language of gestures and through the language of mimicry and gestures, then language eventually emerged. And I find it interesting that contemporary neuroscientists are coming to very similar conclusions, that language must have emerged. I was talking to Vittorio Gallese, who's one of the discoverers of mirror neurons, out of this ability to mirror each other's facial expressions and understand on the basis of mimicry. So it's an hypothesis, of course, but to come back to Lacan, it's also interesting that Lacan, in the mirror stage, quotes a figure like Roger Caillois, who is one that I pay attention to. So the short answer to why don't I focus so much on Lacan or Freud is because they got so much attention already, whereas who knows Roger Caillois. But Lacan mentioned Roger Caillois' theory of animal mimicry and legendary psychasthenia in the mirror stage. And it's interesting that figures that Kaiwa are picked up by new materialist thinkers like Jen Bennett, for instance, who are interested in thinking about embodiment and affects and affective contagion in more materialist sense. So maybe there is no binary, a clear-cut binary between these genealogies, because Lacan was part of a generation of intellectuals that came of age with figures like Georges Bataille, with Sartre, and so forth, in the France of the 30s and 40s, dominated very much by Alexandre Kojève interpretation of Hegel, self-other dialectics. And in many ways, Girard's understanding of mimetic desire can be read as part of that tradition as well. And maybe if I pushed a little bit against or put the limelight on figures that are less emphasized, it's also because that tradition has been very dominant in my upbringing, in my genealogical formation.
It's just interesting. There almost seems to be a pattern that, Freud, starting from his interest in hypnosis, kind of then breaks from it, distances himself from it, and develops the talking cure, focusing on language. And then with Lacan, you see the same pattern, like being interested in Kaiwa and the mirror stage, and then backing off and being interested in language and symbolic, as if every interest in the mimetic kind of leads to this counter reaction with a focus on the symbolic. As if it's like a cycle of responses.
Absolutely. I think, to use the concept, there is a pathos of distance. And I noticed it in the genealogy of mimesis, that very often after the emphasis on mimetic pathos, on an embodied mimesis, comes a moment of distancing, either in the author himself or in the disciple, in which the other aspect, the mediated aspect of mimesis comes along. You find it in the dialectic between Girard and Derrida as well, two figures that one emphasizes linguistic difference and mediation, whereas for Girard, it's all about assimilation, embodied assimilation. And so I think indeed there are mimetic and anti-mimetic movements in mimetic studies, and one gains from looking at the movement and not being polarized only on one aspect or the other. So thanks for bringing in Lacan in the discussion. Stijn.
Okay, so this kind of connects with what Yasco and Jan just said. So we were asked to see connections, and I can see at least two connections with my own research from the past. And one clear connection is with my research on the work of the French philosopher and art historian Georges Didi-Huberman. Now, I think many of the theories he develops are quite similar in a way to yours. There are interesting affinities, but and he's interested in many of the same authors and concepts, but at the same time, there are also clear differences. And to this day, he remains skeptical of the term mimesis, but he hears it in the old-fashioned sense, of course, or in the Platonic sense. So throughout the 80s and 90s, he started out by kind of critiquing specifically the use of the term mimesis in art history. And he hears it in this old-fashioned sense as realistic representation or mirroring of something. And he's interested in the phenomena that you described, that people see a painting of a saint doing this and they imitate it. But he actually critiques this, and he's interested in non-figural elements in paintings of Fra Angelico or Vermeer. And he theorizes these in terms of symptomatic expressions, so in terms of Freudian symptoms, unconscious expressions. Now, later, from the 2000s onward, I think there was a bit of a change. So he becomes interested in the way images or gestures can actually transmit forms of pathos or unconscious desires, like to other people all throughout time. And here he is influenced by the work of Aby Warburg. And for example, in 2016, he curated an exhibition called Soulèvement, or Uprisings, with images like that. So a lot of photos or images or artworks depicting gestures, gestures indicating the desire to rise up against oppression. So, and at the time, it was a stated intention with his exhibition, he wrote it in the catalog and such, that he hoped that seeing such images would actually like trigger or instigate similar feelings, pathos, or desires in the viewer. So you could say that he has a very mimetic theory of images, but he still remains skeptical of this term mimesis, he still hears this in terms of like representation, which is also why, well, he would say that a response to images can never be reduced, in his view, to imitation. A response is always much more singular, much more complex, more diverse. It's intertwined with, you know, people's specific desires. And he would always find the word imitation a reduction, even though the exhibition is full of examples of imitation. It's full of footage of one person raising his fist, and then a lot of people raise their fist. But this is also the reason why he is skeptical of incorporating theories about mirror neurons into art theory, because in his view, this leads to a view of art as like purely imitative, while he sees response as more diverse. So this is kind of one connection that I see, but I also wonder what you make of his critique of imitation. Now, the second strand, that's just a brief connection. My first postdoctoral project was about German writers and theorists, mainly beginning of the 20th century, who were all in their own way interested in these phenomena like contagion, or they were interested in theories about immunity. And I know that you use immunization also in your writings. Now, so they were interested in these phenomena like the masses and such, and how they could be contagious or how they could be pathogenic somehow, have pathological effects. But I believe that their concern was not really so much with these phenomena, but that these phenomena, that they became problematic or worse in times of great change, and that the whole pathological effect, that it actually came from people trying to resist change, or trying to resist the force or the pressure to change to certain circumstances. And I wonder what you make of that. And to connect it with the psychoanalytic theme, I think this is also a Freud view. Like, as you know, in Beyond the Pleasure Principle, Freud said that organisms as such want to remain inert. They do not want to change. They resist change, and they will act aggressively if they are forced to change. So I think a lot of people in the early 20th century, I think they would see it like that people start doing all kinds of bizarre collective behavior because they were resisting change, or they were resisting the need for society to change to new times. So I wonder how, it's a big question, but how your view on mimesis, how that connects with this kind of a bit more Freudian view that people resist change. Or would you simply not agree with that, Freud?
It's only the big questions that we raise here. Yeah, nothing small.
Thanks so much, Stijn, for bringing in Didi-Huberman and asking this important question. First of all, I'm happy you bring in Didi-Huberman because it's one of the figures that I always planned to study more detail in. And as you end up doing a project with different perspectives, you never have enough time. And so I'm only familiar with Didi-Huberman's interest in Bataille, which is one of my source of interests. And I saw the continuities. So it's definitely a figure that is interesting to me. I'm not surprised he resists the notion of mimesis, because every time I talk to art historians, I have that same reaction, because the Platonic paradigm of mimesis as representation or imitation is so dominant in art history that it's difficult to emphasize a different mimesis that has to do with difference in many ways as well. I noticed that with an art historian named John O'Neill. Was a very interesting book on neuro art history. He's open to mirror neurons, but he was resisting the notion of mimesis, and so was trying to opening up the possibility of thinking of mirror neurons as a form of mimesis. So I understand the resistance. That's one of the reasons that I think it's important, or at least in the project, to open up mimesis beyond representation, and that's why I pushed against that dominant definition. Precisely to have conversations with authors that would otherwise reject the concept, but be very interested in the phenomenon. Another example is Deleuze. Deleuze doesn't like the concept of mimesis at all, because exactly the Platonic legacy that is up against, but is very interested in contagion and the phenomena that you described. So that's just the first general point that I would like to make, that maybe it's just a question of terminology, but sometimes opening up a concept to a tradition that is broader allows for conversations that wouldn't take place if we stick to the dominant definition. And that's something that I noticed in the project, that it's not just a linguistic transformation to say mimesis, let's go back to mimos, to performance, to acting, to contagion, and so forth, but it does open up dialogues. And so I hope that the dialogue with Huberman, mediated by your work on Huberman, you worked a lot on him, will continue. On the question of change and transformation, left to think about it. It's true that the discipline of crowd psychology emerges in a period of fast transformation, people assembling in cities. Gustave Le Bon, a reactionary thinker, is indeed using theories that were around before him, Gabriel Tarde, for instance, in order to develop a theory of the mass that was then spread across literary studies. And I got interested in this phenomenon of crowd contagion, also like you, through modernism. The crowd is everywhere in modernist fictions. Joseph Conrad, D.H. Lawrence, these are figures that I studied and were interested in it. Is it the fear of change? Maybe one way of looking at it is that there is indeed a dimension of crowd behavior that is more easily manipulated for conservative political reasons on the right. There is somehow violence, reactive or reactionary emotions spread more easily in a crowd. And so indeed it could be a connection to be made that whenever a change is introduced that can be seen as progressive, the opposite crowd phenomena ensues.
Could it be that, for example, with Trump or the storming of the Capitol, that there is a kind of a connection between what you see as mimetic behavior and a more general resistance to changes in society, a certain reactionary impulse, to look back at the past and things like that. Could that go together?
I think so. Thanks for making that connection, because I think it opens up the connection between mimesis and myth, which is central to the rise of fascism, for instance, and has been central to my interest in neo-fascism. Theorists like Philippe Lacour-Labarthe, for instance, and Jean-Luc Nancy have written a short essay titled The Nazi Myth, Le Mythe Nazi, where they argue that myth is an instrument of identification. It can be mobilized precisely in order to generate collective emotions that are very open to returning to a state of order, a mythic state of order, the nation, make it great again, or the race, or the Boden, the soil rooted in the earth. So I think that the connection, fear of transformation, could be done via the return to myth and how it's central to the development of fascism, old and new.
The kind of mimesis that you're talking about, is it almost by definition socially regressive, in that we reproduce existing models, existing behavioral patterns, pre-existing types, role models, and so on. At least it's the thing is, if you're doing something new, you're not doing mimesis in a way, right? Isn't that the Marx saying, let the dead bury their dead, It's no more mimesis, okay, no more imitating the past. I mean,
that's a good point that you're bringing up. And indeed, in this violence book, obviously I emphasize the pathological side, and in the new fascism as well. But I do make a point in stressing that mimesis is not inherently regressive, that it goes beyond this pathology and what I call pathology. And maybe one way of explaining it genealogically, and to go back also to the Didi-Huberman kind of fear of this simple imitation, is that I was informed by a deconstructive tradition of thinking about mimesis, where mimesis is linked to writing. For Derrida, writing, l'écriture, is mimetic, and it's linked to transformation and becoming, or repetition and difference. And so that genealogy is also internal to my thinking about mimesis, which on the one hand, there is the Girardian model, this fear of an assimilation, of becoming the same, and the violence that ensues. And on the other hand, there is this other tradition that is more interested in not repeating the same, but creating. In the notion of mimetic agon, for instance, well, in mimetic agon, Aristotle's reply to Plato is not the same. It's radically different. It's actually the opposite. And so there is the possibility to create something new out of it. So I haven't emphasized it enough in my presentation today because the focus is on violence. But I do think that mimesis is generative of difference. And an author that would be the counter example with respect to crowd behavior would be Gabriel Tarde. Gabriel Tarde has a book titled Les Lois de l'Imitation, the law of imitation, where he argues that society is an aggregate of people imitating each other, but generating repetitions with difference.
Right. Yeah.
And that's why Deleuze, for instance, was interested in
Right.
Tarde. So I think that is also something that maybe ties in with what Mathijs wants to discuss.
I think so, yeah. So the main connections I see between your project and what I'm interested in is that I've been and I'm still very interested in resonance theory, mainly as developed by the German sociologist Harmut Rosa. And Rosa develops in 2016, he published his book called Resonance, so Resonance, in which he presents what he calls resonance as the solution to acceleration or alienation. And this means that it's kind of the second part, a more positive part or counterpart of a larger project. Before he focused on resonance, he wrote a lot about what he called forms of social acceleration, and he published his book on where he presents acceleration and process of acceleration as a new theory of modernity. So for him, he says, what characterizes modernity is acceleration of the pace of life, acceleration in the context of our own experiences of our lives. Everything is speeding up. We don't have time anymore to do what we really want to do. But also when it comes to technological innovation, all of these different areas of life, he says, well, there are various acceleration processes going on. And he says that results to a large extent in forms of alienation. So we become disconnected from ourselves, from others, from nature, from, well, anything around us, basically. So it also shows that he's clearly embedded in the tradition of critical theory. Well, his idea was, well, I've now described all of these processes resulting in forms of alienation. What's the cure, or what's the answer to these social pathologies? And he says that's resonance. In that book, he develops, it's a really big book. He develops a whole theory about what resonance would entail. And basically, he says, well, resonance is an experience that you can best be described by saying, well, you start resonating with something, with some other, something outside of you. What characterizes resonant experiences for him is that they are uncontrollable, they're kind of spontaneous, they kind of overcome you. They're multidirectional, mainly you are affected by something outside of you, so it goes towards you and it affects you. But on the other hand, you also put something into it. You put emotion into it, he says, and he writes this down with like emotion with an arrow, E arrow motion goes one way, one direction, and then F arrow the other side, affection. So it goes both ways. And so it goes these two ways. It's uncontrollable. And lastly, he says it has to be transformative. So it has to, in some kind of way, do something with you or to you. It changes you to some extent. And then he describes various axes of resonance. So he says you can resonate in the context of religion, for example. You can resonate with religious ideas or religious experiences, but also with religious images, I would say. There can be a resonant relationship between you and that image. Or maybe if you start meditating on this image of suffering Christ, that's an experience of resonance. But maybe this experience between Mary and Jesus, that's also maybe a resonant experience. But he also talks about experiences of nature, those can be resonant, experience of art. But also, he also talks about social forms of resonance. It has to do with politics. You can resonate with communities, with groups of people, with friends, with family, etc. It also talks about material forms of resonance, so you can resonate with objects around you. So it's a very broad theory, and he uses this notion of resonance to, well, analyze realize and foreground the importance of all kinds of relationships and connections to people and objects and institutions and phenomena outside of us. What's interesting, I think, about this theory, and this is where I saw one of the resonances between resonance theory and mimesis, is that one of the a lot of people have, to some extent, criticized him, but also asked him, and this is also the question that I would like to ask you, is that there seems to be kind of an entwinement of descriptive and normative aspects in resonance theory. So on the one hand, he's a sociologist who describes, we are all longing for resonance in a world that is alienated. We see this when people go to soccer matches, listen to music, go to museums, vote for political parties. So it explains what we long for and what we want to do. So we need resonance around us. But at the same time, he also says we should constitute a world that is resonant. He uses it as kind of a normative yardstick for even thinking about the good life. The good life for him is a life that is resonant. He even talks about resonance as maybe resulting in a theory about beauty, that what constitutes an experience of beauty is a resonant experience. And there, according to those people, and this is also something that I've written about, there can be a tension there. So if on the one hand, resonance is used to explain all kinds of different phenomena, but at the same time it's used to say, well, this is what the world should be like, how we should behave, how we should constitute experiences, then there might be a problem. And this problem is often, the most extreme examples often work the best here. So one of the examples that is often mentioned is the example of Nazi, who is part of a National Socialist rally, part of a huge crowd, looking up at a leader, a Führer, who is talking to them. And then the question is asked, isn't this also a form of resonance? That person undergoes change, feels part of this whole group, feels one with this community, etc., etc. It goes both ways. So isn't this also a form of resonance? Maybe it is, and that would be the descriptive aspect. So that would be, then resonance enables us to explain what goes on there and why also new forms of populism and neo-fascism, etc., still keep occurring and popping up, and in various ways still resonate with people. So it would enable us to explain these phenomena. But then it's impossible to, at least in the way as Rosa does this, to also use resonance as normative yardstick, because that would mean that would be the kind of experience that he would be in favor of. And of course, he's not in favor of those kinds of experiences. So if we link this to your theory, then my question is, how do you distinguish bad forms of mimesis from good forms of mimesis? Because I think, where do I have this? Oh yeah, on page, what page is page 67 of Homo Mimeticus. Maybe I should just quote you. So you write, in the end, the genealogy of Homo Mimeticus goes beyond good and evil. The pathologies, and then the hyphen is between brackets, of mimesis open up complementary possibilities that look simultaneously in opposed directions, namely both towards social pathologies that trigger violent rivalry, scapegoating, resentment, affective contagion, new fascism, epidemic contagion, related sicknesses. And alternatively, and without contradiction, towards pathologies that strive contra-dominant life-negating currents animated by nihilistic forms of resentment to promote vital bonds of sympathy, cooperation, public happiness, and joyful inclinations. So within as you describe here, it goes beyond good and evil, to use the Nietzschean phrase, and these two directions kind of complement each other to some extent within mimetic movements. But then my question would be, how do you distinguish them? Or is it possible to distinguish them? When does a pathology become a pathology? And especially since you write a lot about forms of populism and neo-fascism. So can we use this theory about mimesis to criticize those movements? Or is it mainly a theory that enables us to analyze and describe them and see what's going on there? So that would be one of my questions.
Thanks very much, Mathijs, for another difficult question. No, it's a great question. It's an important question, and I'm glad you bring up Harmut Rosa. And when I was talking to sociologists during the project, like when I was talking to the art historian was Didi-Huberman, and with the sociologists, they always tell me, you have to read Rosa. And I saw the book Resonance, 800 pages. I said, yeah, sure, I will read it when I have time. And now I finally had time to delve a bit into Rosa. And I see why people were telling me to read it. As you point out, there are numerous overlap between his notion of resonance and what I call mimesis. I like the fact that it's a musical concept, and if the visual dimension of mimesis is the one that it tends to be dominant, the mirror stage is still part of the specular relation. I'm interested in form of mimesis that affect the entire body, and so the examples that Rosa gives, the concert, the forest, this intimacy, phenomenological experience that I think as a sociologist quite unique in analyzing, I think resonates very much with what I'm interested in. Now, to get towards your question, you point out that Rosa defines resonance as the solution to the problem of acceleration. That's the beginning of the book. And so that move forces him, in a certain sense, to emphasize resonance as a solution, the positive side of mimesis, as I would call it. And so I can see why people would come along. Actually, it's also one of my questions. When people are part of a movement, of a group, that can be resonance and be linked to something pathological. The example of the Nazi crowd, I think is a relevant example, or the new fascists. So that's where I would say I differ from Rosa by saying that mimesis is not only good or not only bad, it's undecidable. It's in between this good and evil. And so to your question, how do you decide then? The notion of pathology indicates a diagnostic approach, which I take once again from Nietzsche. Nietzsche sees the figure of the philosopher as some sort of diagnosis culture, and there is a critical decision, right? Critique means to decide, and how do you decide? I don't have a yardstick for that, and that's why I'm interested in having these discussions, because pathologies, it's in the plural. There are different logoi, there are different discourses that are required in order to come to a critical decision on whether it's pathological or not. And so when I do write about new fascist movements, I draw on political theory and crowd psychology and those phenomena, and I try to come to a diagnostic on the basis of those discourses. And I think there is a critical dimension. It's not only descriptive. The new fascism book, it's a critique of those movements as well. But those are situational analysis. And I would say that one of the things that I find productive in the humanities, in literary studies, philosophy, and so forth, is often the focus on a specific case study, that you don't develop a general theory, or maybe people do develop general theories, but the pathologist is meant as a pluralist theory that will always depend on a specific analysis of case studies. So for instance, in the Homo Mimeticus book that you mentioned, I spent a lot of time on Eichmann. I don't have a ready-made answer. I just read the case as well as I can. And so I think as scholars in the humanities is what we can try to pass on, the kind of the skills of interpretation. That's also another Nietzschean thing, interpret it first, and then if you can come to a diagnostic or a decision, that at the end of a long process. But there is no yardstick for that, I would say. Each new phenomena, we all mentioned ChatGPT, or many of us did. Okay, what is that? We'll have to be specific in the diagnostic, and be careful with generalizations, because indeed it always goes beyond binaries, the good and evil, pathologists and pathologists. So I'm sorry to say I don't have the yardstick, I don't have one answer, but I would emphasize the importance of what Nietzsche would call perspectival analysis, where every time you draw on a specific discourse, tradition, tools of interpretation, and try with those to come to an evaluation. All right. Did you have another question, or?
I do have a follow-up question, but I don't.
Well, we still have a moment. So if there are other questions, either from people online or here, we can take them. Or if you have another question, I'm also happy to address.
Yeah, my question is about the notion of autonomy. It's related because, well, a lot of philosophers, especially coming from the Kantian perspective, argue that maybe a possible normative like yardstick that Rosa could use is a specific notion of autonomy, the ability to think for yourself, to reflect on yourself, to distinguish, well, make some kind of distinction between yourself and others, and that could function as a yardstick, for example, in the context of forms of neo-fascism, that those totalitarian forms of thinking kind of overshadow, undermine, or corrode, or whatever, the ability to become an autonomous person, however we think about the notion of autonomy. Yeah, related to that, I was curious, but how do you think of the notion of autonomy? Is there a place for the notion of autonomy within theories about mimesis? What's left of like the individual autonomous subject, or does that kind of like disappear in kind of a flow of like mimetic movements and gestures and moments? Or yeah, it's a huge question, so I don't know if you can answer, but I'm curious about this. Yeah.
Yes, only the difficult questions today.
Yeah. Which will be the easy one.
Exactly. Fundamental questions. Yes. In many ways, the theory of Homo Mimeticus is a critique of the autonomous subject, right? There is a strong tendency in philosophy that starts, I was mentioning Plato, the idea of the philosophers that retreats from the social world and distances himself from the phenomenal world in order to contemplate the idea, it's a story of an individual, right? An autonomous individual climbing through the tools of dialectical reason in order to access the idea of the good. This vita contemplativa is challenged by the Homo Mimeticus, and I use, for instance, figures like Arendt, who are in a way inspired by Kant to emphasize not only the vita activa, but also what I call the vita mimetica. There is no outside of the cave. We are always already in mimetic relations, and so autonomy, there is no nomos, there is no law that we can give to ourselves automatically. What I find interesting in the Platonic myth is that in the journey to the vita contemplativa, the philosopher in Plato's story needs somebody who frees him, right? It's not an autonomous kind of movement. You need a teacher that shows you the way out. And so it's always already relational, even within the myth that establishes an autonomous view of rational thinking. But that at the same time, I would say, doesn't mean that we are completely determined. One of the difficulties that I have with philosophical distinction is the either or, either you're on the side of free will and autonomy, or you're completely determined where there is no free will whatsoever. And the entire idea of a pathology is that there is a back and forth vibration or oscillation between these polarities that allow us to develop form of marginal or partial autonomy but always in relationship with others. And one of the fundamental aspects that I want to stress is that that the relations come first. And it's interesting talking to neuroscientists who have done experiments with newborns, for instance. There is an experiment that is done with mothers and newborns that Vittorio Gallese told me. And the mother is supposed to interact normally with the newborn and then to block all forms of facial expression for 3 minutes. And autonomy on both sides flies out the window. Most mothers cannot do it because the baby will start developing signs of distress, first checking and then crying, and the mother won't be able to do it. And I'm not setting up a gender binary thing. As a father, I can see that phenomenon. You cannot block it, and maybe we see it when we are part of a emotions are collective, and we see the limits of autonomy when we are in collective sphere. That's why I think somebody like Rosa is interesting for mimetic studies, because it's very sensitive to group phenomena. At a concert, try to remain autonomous at a concert. You can maybe try for a while, but not for long if you like the band. Good, but thanks very much for ending on that note and reminding us of potential allies, I would say, for mimetic studies, because these figures are still alive. Didi-Huberman, Lacan, unfortunately not, but there are many Lacanians. But Didi-Huberman and Harmut Rosa are. I wanted to show you a slide, but I'm not sure I can see it. It is a slide with a series of interviews that I've been doing with a number of figures across disciplines, because mimetic connections, mimetic studies is a pluralist approach that invites different perspectives. These figures include Jean-Luc Nancy, Edgar Morin, J. Ellis Millers, Adriana Caballero, and others. And so it would indeed be interesting to continue. I mean, the project is now officially over, but thinking about mimesis, I hope just started, or at least this new thinking about mimesis. So inviting people like Didi-Huberman or Harmut Rosa to further mimetic studies would be great. But for today, I'm very grateful for you taking the time to think about Homo Mimeticus and the theory that we proposed. I should also say it's a collective effort. It has been a collective effort. I had a picture with different members of the team. And I very much look forward to continuing the discussions, because I'm sure that I didn't answer all the questions for kind of, with a full stop. Good. Thank you all for joining. Be seeing you on this side of the screen hopefully soon.
Yeah.